St. John's Lutheran Church, the oldest Orthodox Lutheran body in Watertown, has for over 140 years preached the gospel of salvation by faith in the atonement of Jesus Christ. Through the years, through temptation from within and without, St. John's, under the blessings of a merciful God, has tenaciously clung to the doctrines of the sacred Scriptures, preaching the pure Word of God as revealed by Martin Luther. The history of St. John's began in Pomerania along the Baltic Sea many years ago. The founders of St. John's lived in this area. They were a small band of Lutherans, closely knit by friendship and relationships and by their common faith in the Lutheran doctrines. But life was difficult and hard for the people. There was no opportunity for advancement unless a person was of royal blood or owned land. Their homeland during the early 1800s was ruled by Frederick the Great, who believed in a government based on strict discipline and authority. His army controlled the state. The school system was a servant of the government. Its only task was to educate the children so they would be more effective as workers for the state. The religious life of the people was also governed by strict rules and regulations laid down by the government. The people tolerated the restrictions until 1817, when Frederick William III, King of Prussia, ruled that the Lutheran and Reformed churches were to be combined to become the United Church of Prussia. Many devout Lutherans refused to renounce their church and its confessions in spite of the threat of prison sentence or worse. So they formed their own church, the Lutheran Free Church. The founders of St. John's were among those who joined the old, unchanged, original Luther body. In 1830, the king attempted to carry out his ruling by force, but was met with strong resistance. Because of the religious unrest, as well as the economic and political difficulties throughout Germany, many people began to talk of emigrating to America. They had read and heard of the freedoms in America, where land was cheap and jobs plentiful, and more important, where they could worship God according to their faith and their conscience. The lure of America, the promised land, burned like a fever in Germany, and nothing could stop the migration. Many said farewell to their families, knowing full well they would never see their relatives again. When the founding fathers of St. John set sail for America from Hamburg, Germany, in early May of 1851, Millard Fillmore was President of the United States and Daniel Webster was the Secretary of State. The Congress had just concluded a bitter debate on slavery. The next year, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin would be published. Stephen Foster was writing his popular ballads, and there was talk of constructing the Panama Canal. Wisconsin, which was to be their new home, was a mere 3 years old. During the long voyage of 8 weeks, the people must have had many doubts as to the wisdom of emigrating to a strange land with no land in sight most of the time, and with crowded, unsanitary living conditions, with a stench that must have been unbearable at times, and with little or no privacy, and the water supply that toward the end was putrid. It's no wonder that there were some of the passengers did not survive the long voyage and were laid to rest in the depths of the sea. And it must have been agonizing during the frightening storms, when they were not allowed on deck and they listened to the howling of the wind day after day while being tossed about helplessly. Their troubles, however, were not over when they reached New York Harbor on June 30th, 1851. Before they were allowed to leave the ship, they were subjected to a medical exam, at which time the examiner pronounced them either free of disease or of disability, or not free of that. In the latter case, The persons would be sent back to his homeland on the next ship. All emigrants, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands that year, had to go through a customs inspection at Castle Gardens, a converted old fort built in 1807. If they could prove that they were able to make a living in America and would not prove to be a burden on the government, or they had sufficient funds to sustain them until they could find work, they were allowed to remain. If not, they too were deported immediately. At one time, Castle Gardens had been a beautiful theater and concert hall. Its most famous entertainer was Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale. Surviving the ordeal and humiliation of customs officials and their examination, the weary travelers made their way through the busy waterfront of New York City to the railroad depot to continue their journey to Wisconsin. Now, while many accounts state that the founding fathers made the journey inland by railroad, it's more plausible that when they reached New York, Buffalo, New York, they opted for the route favored by nearly all the emigrants heading for the Midwest by switching to a steamship or a sailboat, depending upon their finances. And from there they proceeded through much of the Great Lakes by way of Lake Erie and through Lake Huron and down Lake Michigan to Milwaukee, where they had to seek other transportation. The railroad to Watertown not having been completed in 1851. In 1851, Milwaukee was considered one of the newest cities in the far west, with a population of 28,000. At that time, the city was slowly recovering from a raging cholera epidemic of the year before, so it would seem highly unlikely that the Pomeranians tarried in the city very long, as some accounts state. They no doubt hurried to make arrangements in hiring wagons to transport their belongings to Watertown. And now, referring to the map at the bottom here, the road connecting Milwaukee to Watertown was known as the Plank Road, considered the best road in the state at that time. It was a toll road with a toll gate every 5 miles along the 45-mile route. The usual charge at any gate was about 12 cents per wagon. Watertown had grown from its small, humble beginnings in 1842 to a thriving community of 4,000 inhabitants in 1851. Mostly made up of German immigrants. Perhaps some of the groups stayed with friends or relatives, or some may have stayed in Van Alstyne's Hotel, located in First and Main Streets, until they were able to find permanent homes. Now, we know very little about the families who arrived from Pomerania. The Dobratzes, the Schumachers, the Klugs, and the Kranings. They were a few that were mentioned. We read most about Mr. and Mrs. Heinrich Kraning, shown here, because he was to become a leading influence in establishing the church and the school, and he later became a teacher in the Pomeranian school. Mrs. Ernestine Kraning, shown here, was intermaiden in pre-married days of Dobratz. The group investigated a German Lutheran congregation in town, but were disappointed with the liberal-minded pastor, so they decided to start their own church. Heinrich Kraning, with the help of John W. Cole, rented a building, which they called the English School, located on the corner of 4th and Division Streets. The buildings still stand. Services were conducted here once a month, with the layman reading a prepared sermon written by a Lutheran pastor, Heinrich Müller of Germany. Later, Pastor Geyer from Lebanon conducted services once a month. In 1854, the congregation applied for membership with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. The congregation was accepted, making St. John's one of the oldest member congregations of the Missouri Synod. The first pastor to be called was the Reverend Kleinige, who came in 1852, but was later asked to leave because he too was very liberal-minded. A call was then sent out for a pastor in late 1854. Candidate Anton Wagner, a new graduate from the Fort Wayne Seminary, accepted the call. He arrived in January in the midst of a terrible snowstorm. Because of that storm, Candidate Wagner's ordination was postponed to February 1st, 1855, and it took place in the largest hall in Watertown, the third floor of the John Cole building, at one time J.C. Penney's and then finally Klein's department store. Meanwhile, the congregation began to build their own first house of worship, a frame structure that was 40 feet by 26 feet on the lot at the corner of Vine and Lynn Streets. When the floor of the rented building on 4th Street collapsed during the church service one day, Pastor Wagner encouraged the congregation to finish the church they had started, and in 2 weeks' time the building was completed, although not furnished, when the church was dedicated on the day of John the Baptist, June 24th, 1855. Pastor Wagner preached while standing on a pew, and the altar was a table covered with a cloth. A year and a half after the dedication of the little frame church, this substantial brick building was constructed to replace the temporary building made of slab wood, which the church fathers had hastily erected to serve as a school shortly after arriving in Watertown. The brick schoolhouse, known as the Pomeranian School, served the congregation until 1887. The building then became a teacherage. In 1931, the building was sold to a private party, and it is still occupied. In 1857, only 5 years after it was organized, St. John's was a thriving congregation of 90 voting members and 381 souls. Pastor Wagner, a man full of enthusiasm and physical stamina, accomplished much toward the growth of the church during the 3 years of his ministry. When he received a call in 1858, the congregation reluctantly approved of his leaving. The Reverend C.J.A. Strassen was called, and he began his long pastorate of 41 years. During this time, the growth of the church and beyond was beyond belief. In 1864, the congregation consisted of 200 families, and it wasn't until unusual for Pastor Strassen to baptize more than 100 children in a year. He instituted the custom of an annual mission day, the first such observance in the Lutheran Church in Wisconsin. And incidentally, the collection at the first mission service was $30.01, and it was sent for mission work among the Wisconsin Indians. Pastor Strassen not only conducted Sunday services, served as interim pastor of Trinity in Lowell and St. Peter's in Concord. He also held midweek services during which the writings of Martin Luther were discussed. The school enrollment for St. John's also increased. Families living in Ixonia felt it was too far to travel to Watertown to school, so they built this school in 1865. Tuition for the year was $15 plus some firewood. The area until 1921 when it was closed due to lack of pupils. The building was sold in 1946. The Lord continued to bless St. John's with a tremendous increase in membership, due mainly because of the many new arrivals from Germany, mostly Lutherans. In 1863, it became necessary to build a new, larger church rather than build onto the existing frame building. A half block of property at 5th and Cady Streets was purchased, and in spite of the rising costs because of the Civil War, the people undertook the immense task of building the church. In 1864, the cornerstone was laid, and the church was dedicated in God's name on June 25th, 1865. The church was of modified Gothic architecture, approximately 100 feet by 45 feet. The tower had a spire 130 feet, topped by a huge cross. There were no bells in the steeple originally when the church was built, but in 1886 a set of 3 bells were purchased and installed. The bells each have a message in English, Latin, and German engraved on their surface, which tell of the faith and the hope of the founding fathers. Those same bells are calling the St. John's people to worship every Sunday morning. The interior had an elevated pulpit situated to the right of the chancel. The lectern was on the left side, and the baptismal font was on the floor of the nave directly in front of the chancel. The balcony extended around the 2 sides and across the rear of the church. The organ was built by Professor Emil Gabler of Watertown, one of the foremost musicians of the state at that time. The organ was described as a magnificent pipe organ with 2 banks of keys, 2 octaves of pedals, and it contained over 1,400 pipes, ranging from 16 feet to 3/4 of an inch in length. It was played for the first time on Sunday, June 27, 1875, by a celebrated organist from Milwaukee, and it was dedicated on July 4th of 1875. It was valued at $5,000. The church itself cost about $15,000. In May of 1868, it was resolved to build a parsonage on the property directly west of the church for the pastor who had been living in a rented home. It served the congregation as a parsonage and teacherage for many years. It is now privately owned. In that same year, 1868, it became apparent that more room was needed for the school due to the increased enrollment. So a temporary frame building, 32 by 22 feet, was constructed. This picture shows that building and Teacher Meyer's class. And in the group is Agnes Miski's father. He's in the second row from the top. He was 13 years old, and the next day he left school to work on the farm. A plan for a larger school was talked about beginning in 1881, but its construction was postponed until 1885. The new school was built on a block east of the church and had 3 large classrooms which were said to accommodate 100 children in each. It also had a confirmation music room, combination confirmation music room. The total cost without furnishings was $6,024. The school served the congregation for 67 years, up to 1954. And upon the resignation of Pastor Strassen, the congregation called Pastor Eggers, shown at the bottom. He was to serve for 47 years. On September 14, 1902, the congregation celebrated its 50th anniversary, and had the unique privilege that day of hearing from all three pastors who had served that church during its most formative years, Pastor Wagner, Pastor Strassen, and Pastor Eggers. In 1902, the congregation numbered 307 voting members. Numbers of souls came to 1,600 with 1,046 communicants. Under the blessings of God, the congregation continued to grow. Soon it became apparent that a larger church was needed to accommodate the increase. A farewell service was held on Easter Monday, April 1st, 1907, and the next day the old church was demolished. And during the construction period, the congregation held services in St. Mark's Church. The cornerstone for the new edifice was laid on June 27, 1907. On April 5th, 1908, the church was finally completed. With great rejoicing, the new house of worship was dedicated to the glory of God. The building is made of glazed red brick with a roof of slate shingles. It is 67 feet by 108 feet long, with a height of 60 feet. The church is of Transylvanian architecture with much symbolism in it. The north steeple and dome represents the state of exaltation, while the shorter represents the state of humiliation. The tall one extends 112 feet in the air and houses 3 large bells. The structure cost over $45,000, a very ambitious undertaking for the members in those days, because the year 1907 was an era of national depression with wages very low, but under God's blessing, the congregation was able to pay the entire cost in a relatively short time. The interior seated about 1,000 people. It had white ornate chancel furnishings, most of which were gifts from individuals and groups within the congregation. For example, the school children donated the baptismal font at the cost of $100. A close-up of the altar shows the statues of Christ and 2 saints, and below the altar table is a 3-dimensional rendering of the Lord's Supper. The stained glass windows on either side depict the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion. The canopied pulpit had tall spires and figures of saints, which were situated on the side of the pulpit. The magnificent stained glass windows on the north and south walls were designed especially for the church, and the windows on either side of the chancel were preserved from the former church and installed in the new church. The church was the scene of many festivals during the church years, including the confirmation services. Christmas found the chancel decorated with Christmas trees, with a banner suspended between the trees proclaiming the birth of Savior, and in other years, 1 large tree was decorated and placed to the right of the chancel, and it was a beautiful sight. St. John's had various organizations over the years. A band was started in 1893 with 13 members who could neither read music or play an instrument, but with constant practice soon became quite proficient. Soon it was in demand for school picnics, for mission festivals, and for playing chorales together with the organ on festival days. The band also played out-of-town engagements. Its director was Principal H.A. Schumacher. A male chorus was also organized by Schumacher. They rehearsed twice a week. And the women also had a choral group, but in 1908 it combined with the male chorus to create the mixed chorus, the second oldest existing organization in the congregation. This chorus took part in an annual Singer Fest held on Sunday afternoons, a gathering of choirs from the Synodical Conference congregations of the area. In 1910, the ladies' choral groups participated in this musical event. In 1918, the Ladies' Aid Society was organized. The 47 members met for the purpose of fostering Christian fellowship, to assist in the charitable endeavors of the congregation, and to take care of the decorations of the house of God. The Ladies' Aid Society was active in many charitable works throughout the years. In 1926, one of their projects was a donation of approximately $8,000 toward the building of a much-needed parish hall. The ladies equipped the kitchen. The men donated their spare time to complete the building. The hall provided a meeting place for the organizations. It had an auditorium on the first floor and a kitchen and dining room in the basement. In 1952, the auditorium was converted into a temporary classroom because the schoolhouse did not have enough space for 7 classrooms. Some rooms had been divided to make for additional classes, which meant that the room was very, very crowded. The church fathers decided the facilities were inadequate for the increased enrollment of 246 children and the 7 teachers employed to instruct the pupils. In 1954, the congregation proceeded with plans for a new school building. The school was dedicated in January of 1956, with classes beginning the next day. By 1962, there were 352 children and 10 teachers on the staff. While the school grew in enrollment, the congregation also increased dramatically. In 1962, there were 2,850 souls with 1,905 communicants. Along with the statistics came the realization that the years had taken their toll on the physical properties of the church, and it felt a complete renovation was needed. The area is now a multi-purpose room. A few items from the former church were salvaged and utilized in the renovated areas. The plaque of the Lord's Supper, which had been on the old altar, can now be seen in the council chambers. The statues of the saints, which had once went on the pulpit, are now displayed on the wall of the church office. One was placed in the school. On October 6, 1968, the church remodeling program was completed and the church rededicated to the glory of God. That day, the congregation gathered in the school and then marched together to the church, led by the 3 pastors, Pastors Caulfield, Gunther, and Pastor Gunlock. There they held a special service. In the midst of great thankfulness for God's blessings, there loomed a cloud of despair. For years there had been a steady increase in liberalism in doctrine and practice in the Missouri Synod, and it culminated in a theological split in Synod. In August 1971, St. John's, along with other conservative congregations, voted to leave the Missouri Synod and join the newly organized Synod, FAL, Federation for Authentic Lutheranism, commonly called FAL. The decision thus ended an association that had lasted 117 years. On June 9, 1975, St. John's voted to apply for membership in WELS, Wells, Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and were accepted. In 1977, the congregation celebrated the 125th anniversary. The theme was Praise for the Past, Prayer for the Future. A deep feeling of gratitude and peace had settled over the congregation at last. At this time, the congregation numbered 1,681 communicants, 2,163 souls, and there were 304 children enrolled in the school, which had a staff of 12 teachers. In 1987 and 1988, we found the congregation embarking on another renovation program, one that would make the church and school more energy efficient. The theme of this project was Forward in Faith. The total cost would be $400,000. The school portion of the renovation was started during the summer with the removal of the glass bricks and installation of a metal siding. The classrooms looked like this before the work began. The kindergarten room after the transformation, when the glass blocks were taken out. New playground equipment was installed and was duly and well tested by 2 experts. A north side addition to the church was constructed, which allowed for much needed storage space for lawnmowers, etc., and a chairlift. And that summer, with a huge derrick overhead, the exterior work of the church began with the painting of the trim from the chancel roof to the steeple domes. Everything was scraped and given a fresh coat of paint. The brick was tuck-pointed. The gold leaf had worn off the crosses on the top of the domes and were re-gilded, and the workers prepared to hoist the cross up to its position on the dome. Meanwhile, preparations were made to conduct services in the gym while the interior of the church was renovated. Hymnals were carried over to the school, where chairs had been set up and a temporary altar placed on the stage. And soon scaffolding covered every inch of the nave and the chapel, and the redecorating began, applying a special covering to the walls. It was interesting to watch the progress being made day by day as workers uncovered the old decorative designs of the 1907 era and were replacing it with a modern design of gold leaf. The old green carpeting was removed, and the new maroon carpeting was laid down. The pews were moved, spacing each farther apart to allow for easier entry and leaving. Modern lighting fixtures were installed. And as the renovation progressed, the congregation was kept informed to the various stages of the work through a bulletin board display. Perhaps the most exciting day was the installation of the huge wooden cross upon which the figure of the ascending Christ would be placed behind the altar. The heavy statue required the help of 5 men to lift it into position, where it now can be seen as a reminder of Christ's love for mankind. The figure of the ascending Christ was carved by a young artist who lives in the Alps of northern Italy. Paul Moroder and his family live in St. Ulrich, a quaint, colorful Italian village which is well known for its many sculptor inhabitants. Paul and his family live in this house. Their workshop is in the lower level of the building. Paul, shown here on the left, his father and 2 brothers are all artists. The father is a master sculptor, and he taught his sons the trade. Paul is shown here working on the Christ figure in his studio. That figure is the one which now graces the chancel of St. John's. Each time the members look at it, they are reminded of God's great blessings to St. John's congregation over the years, and the realization that the many renovations, the building programs, and the growth of the congregation have all been gifts from God. They have grown in grace because of these blessings. And then, at the traditional Easter display, as they look over the old pictures of the many dedicated pastors, teachers, and various organizations, they are reminded of the people who unselfishly gave of their time, their talent, and treasures to serve the Lord. As they examine the displays of old Bible artifacts and newspaper clippings depicting the history of St. John's, they are again cognizant of the privilege it has been to serve God and in bringing His Word to waiting hearts. In 1994, St. John saw fit to observe the 140th anniversary of its founding with special displays depicting historical events in its life and remembering the pastors and teachers who labored so long and so faithfully in God's vineyards. They remembered with grateful hearts Pastor James Fricke, who had recently retired, and how they had grown spiritually through Pastor Kauffeld's sermons and his Bible class studies, who for 26 years at St. John's had pointed the way to heaven. On that same occasion, they welcomed Principal Larry Colliard and his family to St. John's family, asking God's blessing in the task of guiding the school children to Christ. The arrival of Pastor Beringer and his family began a new chapter in the life story of St. John's. He had been installed just a few weeks before the festivities marking the 140th year of existence of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church. God's grace, it was acknowledged by all, has certainly been with St. John's congregation for the past 140 years. Saying, as though did those of old, "But as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord." May they and all of God's children continue to walk in faith and love and obedience to His holy word. And may they go forward in faith, praising God for the past and with a prayer for the future. More than a decade has passed since this last recorded bit of history of St. John's took place. We leave it to another generation to record that decade, and as many more decades as the Lord grants them. May the Lord bless them and keep them.